The risk for the Israelis is that whatever they're planning in southern Lebanon, I don't think it's an all-out war, but it's a significant incursion, could prompt Hezbollah to use those high trajectory weapons, and they could be directed at Israeli population centers, key infrastructure projects, electricity grids, water purification centers. And if that happens, then you're going to end up in a major confrontation, which will involve pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria attacking U.S. forces there. The Houthis will get involved in launching their ballistic missiles. And eventually, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump to an Israeli-Iranian sustained confrontation, which I cannot imagine would occur without the involvement.
Aaron David Miller is the former Middle East negotiator for the US and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron, hello, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, and the UK Foreign Secretary this evening meeting his US, French and other counterparts in Paris. He's called for a ceasefire and others have called for calm. To what extent is this just performative? Because they know Israel's going to ignore them. They feel they've got Hezbollah on the run and Hezbollah wants to respond to this humiliation.
I wrote these talking points for half a dozen American secretaries of state. I think it's largely performative. It's necessary, but in terms of any of these talking points, whether it's Tony Blinken's well-intentioned calls or Foreign Secretary Lammy's calls, it's not going to make much difference. All you got to do is look at the last 11 months. And what you see is a divided, distracted, self-interested international community having almost no impact whatsoever on changing the trajectory of either the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the south, the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict in the north, or frankly, the Iranian-Israeli conflict. What we have here is 3 wars of attrition. They have no political solutions to them. At best, it's a management enterprise if external powers are lucky enough and skillful enough. But right now, I'm afraid I see risk readiness, certainly on the part of the Israelis, who I think are determined to break the linkage that Hezbollah has created between their own attacks on Israel as part of the axis of resistance and what's happening in Gaza. In other words, the Israelis, I think, believe there will be no ceasefire agreement. No question about that. Neither Yahya Sinwar or Benjamin Netanyahu, neither of them are interested in signing any kind of ceasefire. Therefore, Hezbollah has the luxury of continuing their attacks on the Israelis under the guise of supporting the Palestinian resistance as part of the axis of resistance. And I think the Israelis, number one, are trying to break that linkage. Number two, you do have the very real problem on both sides of the border, right? 170,000 Israelis and Lebanese have been dislocated from their homes. And clearly, since there's no viable government in Lebanon, the pressure on the current Israeli government is mounting to try to find a way to deal with the northern front so that these people can return home. And then you have Benjamin Netanyahu's political calculations. Last point I would make, sorry to drone on.
Okay. But
the reality is that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want a regional war, which we could see, a multi-front regional war, but he does want a sort of controlled escalation because the reality is when the shooting stops, then the question of accountability and responsibility will once again dominate Israeli politics. And here is a man, the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, 4 years running in a Jerusalem district court. He's due to testify again, for the first time in December. If he loses power, he's either going to face 2 very bad outcomes. Number one, a conviction and maybe jail time, or a plea deal, which will end his political career.
Well, so he's prepared to make others pay a very high price in order to preserve his own skin. And I see the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, has said that there are, and I quote, significant opportunities, but also heavy risks. I wonder, what do you think those heavy risks are, given that Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has said that Israel has crossed several red lines, and there are some in the international community, particularly at the UN, who will agree with him?
Right. Look, I think the reality is that Hezbollah has a repository of high trajectory weapons of varying ranges, lethalities, and precisions, particularly the precision guided munitions. And remember, this is not Iran, where it takes 12 minutes for a cruise missile to travel from Tehran into Israeli airspace. Hezbollah launches their high trajectory weapons, of which they have 150 to 200,000 of them. You're talking 90 seconds. But it works both ways because Hezbollah is incredibly vulnerable to escalation dominance, which the Israelis control. The risk for the Israelis is that whatever they're planning in southern Lebanon, I don't think it's an all-out war, but it's a significant incursion, could prompt Hezbollah to use those high trajectory weapons, and they could be directed at Israeli population centers, key infrastructure projects, electricity grids, water purification centers. And if that happens, then you're going to end up in a major confrontation, which will involve pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria attacking US forces there. The Houthis will get involved in launching their ballistic missiles. And eventually, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump to an Israeli-Iranian sustained confrontation, which I cannot imagine would occur without the involvement of the United States. So, boom.
Well, that's something nobody wants. I don't think even the Iranians want that.
No, they
because
don't.
people talk about it a lot, but I mean, we're quite some way from that, aren't we?
I think yes, but I really do believe that the risk aversion that characterized Hezbollah, Israel, and Iran, but particularly Hezbollah and Israel under these circumstances, that risk aversion has been converted for a variety of reasons to risk readiness. I think there's a way still to get out of this, but I think it would take far-sighted choices on the part of at least two leaders.
Yeah.
And neither Hassan Nasrallah nor Benjamin Netanyahu have been known for their flexibility and willingness to compromise.
Indeed not. Aaron, I've got a message from one of my listeners, Nick, here, and I was going to come back to it in my own commentary, but I want you to respond to it. And Nick says, does no one else see the blatant, almost obscene irony of the report that Israel is going to war to gain land for 60,000 of its displaced people, when almost the whole of Palestine is full of people displaced multiple times into smaller and smaller strips of land, not least the million plus currently displaced civilians in Gaza? Now, that will resonate with some people. Does it resonate with you?
Well, ironies abound. I mean, the Israelis aren't interested in taking additional territory. They already occupy the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and have a semblance, a reality of control even in Gaza. The Israelis want to essentially restore normalcy to their population, right? Israelis think first and foremost about Israelis, and Palestinians think first and foremost about Palestinians. But your caller is right in the sense that driving this conflict for decades now has been the problem of what I call the much too promised land. And the only useful deployment of the phrase river to the sea is to describe the problem that exists between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. You have 15 million humans. What sort of political alignment and solution are there for these 15 million Israelis, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, and then what? At least 6-7 million Palestinians under Israeli occupation. My judgment here, and I was at the last serious effort to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in July of 2000, where Bill Clinton brought Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak together at Camp David for 13 days, and we wrestled with the 5 or 6 core issues that define this conflict: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and of course, ending all conflict and claims. And by the time that summit was over, the gaps on those core issues were wider than the Grand Canyon. So look, we can talk all day long about asymmetry of power, right? The Israelis have it. But the reality is, it's not one hand clapping. You're going to need a Palestinian leader and an Israeli leader who are prepared to look at these 5 core issues and make some very tough decisions.
Okay.
And right now, I'm describing a situation which is in a galaxy far, far away, not back here on planet Earth, because you do not have those leaders, not in Israel, not among Palestinians. And I think that's what you need, leaders who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies.
Well, let's wait and see what emerges in the coming weeks, days indeed. Aaron David Miller, former Middle East negotiator for the US. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. You know how to get